has showed tremendous skills in the going down one of our major rivers that we like to kayak. It was great fun. Daniel was there with his son. I'll show you a little bit about that at the end of the talk. But during this session, he asked me whether I could talk about, here you go, whether I could talk about the ACL injury and the time to shift, is it time to shift the paradigm, which is one of the topics that I like to talk about. And interesting is, I'm a sports surgeon, but I'm really not an ACL researcher. I'm a cartilage researcher, and I want to share with you a little bit why I got there. You can see that on the left side, this is Kentucky. On the right side, that is Magna Frisia, which actually the area of Utrecht is part, as well as the area where I grew up and where I was born, which is right here near Wilhelmshaven, where I grew up. And now in Kentucky, the number one thing is basketball, right? And so the so-called Kentucky Wildcats, typically one of the best teams every year in college sports. And with that, you can basically see things like that happen. And when he comes down, exactly what we just saw over and over is happening to one of our players right here. And you see this position is obviously exactly what we have just heard about. Now, the problem with that is that the ACL injuries do matter. And ACL injuries do matter for various reasons. A, because obviously it is an acute injury, but also they have long-term implications that are associated with post-traumatic osteoarthritis. And that is one of the reasons that I'm involved with ACL injuries, because I'm interested in the long-term consequences after these injuries that we then end up seeing typically as cartilage repair specialists. There's relatively little known about the initiation, progression, and the timing of post-traumatic osteoarthritis. And this is what you see here. On the left, you see a normal joint at the time of ACL injury, and on the right, this is the same joint 18 months later, after the articular cartilage has started to break down. Now, that doesn't happen in everybody, but there's a certain percentage of patients where you will see that. We know that ACL injury is a post-traumatic osteoarthritis model. It's various previous authors and a lot of work done by Stefan Lohmander and Oyestad and others has shown that this is real. About 10 to 15 years after ACL injury, we see radiographic, but worse so, clinical signs of osteoarthritis with young patients. And if you look at that carefully, the mean age here in this last group is 32. These are female soccer players, 12 years after ACL tears, with a mean age of 32, where more than half of them are clinically symptomatic. That means they cannot really walk to baggage carousel at 15, without having pain here in the Amsterdam Schiphol airport. We also know as a background that there is a significant amount of inflammation that plays a role. And the interesting thing here is even though this is a normal healing response, and we have all seen these schemes before and these schematics, but in the knee joint after an ACL injury, this may have a different function, simply because normal tissue repair for the ACL does not happen, and the blood that ends up fueling the initial inflammatory response inside the knee has detrimental effects on the articular cartilage. The current gold standard in imaging is this. And anybody who has done Kellgren-Lawrence grading based on simple, even standardized x-rays knows that this is a very, very difficult thing to do standardized well. It's easy to differentiate between a grade 0 and a grade 4, but everything in the middle, very difficult. So this is really not a good gold standard, even though in the US this is still considered as such. And so newer radiographic detection methods with T1 row imaging, for example, as you see here depicted down in the left corner, which you can also quantify better, really have come into play. And this is basically the standard today how we measure the beginning and the progression of post-traumatic osteoarthritis. This is not just a single trick pony. This is a 3-trick pony, which means you have to look at PROs, biomarkers, and imaging in conjunction. And there may even be a 4th pillar, which we could call functional analysis at 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, whenever you want it. And what this is really changing our paradigm to looking at osteoarthritis particularly is that we are going away from looking at it when the damage is done, and we can't really modify it. We've learned that over and over, that once the osteoarthritis is fully established, it is almost impossible to do any disease modification. You can treat symptoms, but you cannot modify the disease. So the paradigm is shifting towards working at the much earlier time points. And this is where we do some of our work, and that leads to different questions that we need to ask. So what is the natural history, for example, of the biomarkers, of inflammatory markers, and patient-reported outcomes immediately following ACL injury? Is there a relationship between early detectable markers and outcomes? And can early anti-inflammatory treatment or interventions, in addition to operative or non-operative ACL treatment, change the outcome? Those are the questions that we are interested in. So there's some work that has been done in the past. In fact, in the early 90s, back in Pittsburgh, my sort of alma mater in the United States, Michelle Cameron did some work with Freddie Fu where they just looked at biomarkers early on, and they found that typically inflammatory markers as well as chondrodegradatory markers are elevated early, but this is a single time point. So they basically looked at all comers at, within the first 6 to 8 weeks after ACL injury, tapped the knees, and found this is how much we have. That sets a stage in terms of we know that there are certain things inside the synovial fluid, or maybe even the serum, that are elevated, but we really don't know where is it going, and we don't know what the significance is. There's some more work that has been done, which I'll show in a second, but the question here is, does it matter in the long run? So in other words, does a certain level at the time 0 really say anything about where this patient ends up a few years later? So in order to answer that question, we need to know longitudinal profiles of biomarkers, ideally from before the injury, which is very difficult to do. And you need to identify the injuries really early and not obtain the longitudinal data for serum, urine, synovial fluid at this early time point. You also need to correlate it to other measures, such as biomarkers, imaging, and PROs, and you need 2 to 5 year outcome assessment. 6 months really probably don't tell us a lot, because most patients really are not even finished with their rehab by that time point. So again, some attempts have been made. Strauss has looked at patients where he correlated IL-6 and MMP3 with lifelong scores as 18 months. However, these are relatively weak correlations. There may be some predictive value. However, to be honest, in order to be able to predict the outcome based on these markers, you need to have much higher volumes. And in order to do that, and this is the real kicker, is you need a clean group, not just longitudinal data, but you need a really clean group of patients up on enrollment. That means no previous other injuries, no previous ACL injuries on the other side, no other previous surgeries on the knee, because otherwise they all get changed, and we know that, particularly serum comp, for example, is a popular marker to measure. Is even changes for me walking across the room to over there if you don't measure it at the correct time. Albrecht, that is the group out of Milan, they looked at some of this in cartilage patients, and they also found that there is some elevations of collagen breakdown products that changes over time. Again, this is a single time point that is measured. That does not really answer the question. A really good approach to this is what Stefan Lohmander has taken. He has done a study, it's called the Canon trial, which is the gift that never stops giving. And this is basically, he randomized 2 groups of patients, patients that underwent early ACL reconstructions and those that were treated non-operatively and then underwent late ACL reconstructions, and he followed their biomarkers. And what you see here, there is difference between the groups. The problem here is this is a study that is predominantly designed to look at how long do you have changes in biomarkers over time. And he sees that you have these, this is a logarithmic scale, up to 6 and I think up to 10 years you have some of these biomarkers are changing. Interestingly, most of them are inflammatory and also from the macrophage-aligned pathways. The problem here is that the enrollment is anywhere between 1 day and up to 6 months up front. So what happens in that time frame is actually quite dramatic. And that's what we were looking at. We designed a randomized clinical trial where we looked at that very carefully. Within the first couple of weeks, we basically saw patients within, on average, 4 days of injury, at around 12 weeks of injury at the time of surgery, and then we kept following them. And this is part of a randomized trial where we looked at 4 different groups. One group at the time of aspiration, got a saline placebo, and the 3 other groups all received cortisone, either at the first aspiration or in the second aspiration or at both aspiration, 40 milligrams of Kenalog. And the idea here was to see whether it can knock down the inflammatory biomarkers early on. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to do several things. First of all, we have a natural history. CTX2, which is a collagen breakdown marker, for example, naturally increases over the first 4 weeks after injury. So that happens really quickly. And that means there's active collagen loss. You will not have CTX2 in the synovial fluid unless collagen is breaking down. The other thing that you find is that if you're comparing time point 1 to time point 3, which is basically within 4 days to about 4 weeks, this is the day of surgery, you see that CTX2 goes up, you see that NTX1, which is a subchondral bone damage marker for collagen type 1, goes up. You also see that MMP3 goes up, and the interleukins, alpha-1 alpha and alpha-1RA, which is basically a response to the increase in interleukin-1, will all go up, indicating that there's clearly a large inflammatory response over these first 4 weeks that is not over, according to the paradigm, after the first 48 hours. If you treat this with triamcinolone, you actually do see an effect. And I don't want to dwell too much on this slide because I want to show you this one. This is really the more important one. And this is CTX2. So you see this is the natural curve for the placebo group. If you give them cortisone, that doesn't happen. So in other words, you have a significant decrease in chondral breakdown if you protect the patient from early inflammatory response. And what we don't know is how cortisone drives that. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But as a matter of fact, if you do that with something as crude as triamcinolone, it does seem to reduce CTX2. Now, for IL-1RA, very different. That's the interleukin-1 receptor antagonist, totally variable at the first time point. This is one of the problems that we have with some of these biomarkers. They are all over the place. So you cannot do cross-sectional data analysis. You have to have it longitudinally, otherwise you will never find anything with this. So the question is this change actually meaningful? So we looked at 22 of these patients where we ended up having enough synovial fluid at the end of the primary analyses, and we looked at whether these biomarkers at the time of surgery correlated with PROs at 3 years postoperatively. And we were categorizing them based on the KOOS quality of life and the IKDC according to the PASS scores. PASS basically dichotomizes the KOOS score into yes, I'm feeling good versus no, I'm feeling bad. This is a fairly easy way to do it, and it allows us to do it with relatively low numbers because we can do simple statistics on it. And what we found is that the patients that failed to reach the quality of life PASS score at the time of surgery had significantly greater levels of interleukin-1 alpha, interleukin-1RA, and MMP9. In other words, they have the highest rates of inflammation at the time of surgery, and 3 years later, they do worse. The same thing you can see with the IKDC. Interleukin-1RA, MMP9 falls out there, but interleukin-1 alpha is still in it. This is probably more likely than not a question of the numbers. So the next step here, what we did is we went and did a so-called SomaScan analysis, which is a proteomics assay. It's about 1,700 different analytes that we are looking for, and this is really a fishing trip. But what we are doing here is we wanted to see which one come back with the highest effect sizes. And we took the 30 highest, and we looked at where do we see anything that we recognize? And what was interesting is that 9 of the top 30 have previously been tied to the onset and the severity of rheumatoid arthritis, out of all things, and only 3 were related to traditional osteoarthritis-related mechanisms. Now that was a little surprising. And then we tried you see the effect sizes here on the side, and we rank that according to effect size. Now, the next thing that you do with this kind of data, you send it through what's called a pathway analysis, which basically means you are trying to find out where all these different factors come from, and you basically throw it into a computer program, and it shows you which major molecular pathways they show up in. And what's interesting here is they all show up in the inflammatory pathways. So is P2A then similar to RA in the beginning? That's certainly new. And we know that the OA-related analytes are increased between 1 and 2 weeks, but 7 of the analytes that had the biggest increases during this time have previously been linked to rheumatoid arthritis. So they are both associated with synovial membrane inflammation, which increases in inflammatory cytokines. In RA, this is initially a response that leads to T and B cell proliferation that we do not have in OA, and we do not really have any evidence to see that after ACL injuries. However, it appears that the initial response to ACL injury may have a distinct biological pathway that may be common with RA. And interesting here is the following. Anybody here who does a lot of arthroscopies has seen those kind of cases. After ACL injuries, typically these are patients that struggle, that either get stiff or that have continued pain, continued synovitis. And you can see these kind of synovitic skins that form over the articular cartilage. I'm sure all of you guys have seen that. And that is something that is fairly unusual. That is not technically a pannus, but it is certainly a creeping kind of, not a substitution, but a creeping tissue development over top of the articular cartilage. And when you fold that over, the cartilage underneath is a lot softer. I don't have any histology, but this is something that we are trying to look into. And that's just the question, is there indeed also clinical evidence that there may be a similarity? So the future directions for us are to continue on our P2A adaptive trial platform, which we've created now. We have a 2nd and a 3rd trial going right now, and we are looking at post-operative hyaluronate to lessen the second hit, which that's the next thing that happens. Now you operate on the patient, and the same thing happens over again. You'll get an increase in your inflammatory markers. Now you're hitting that already pre-injured joint from in the perspective of cartilage a second time. And we try to avoid that. We also look more specifically into IL-1RA as a specific target rather than cortisone as a rather unspecific drug to target the inflammation. And the other way to eliminate a second hit would be to do really early surgery, where basically the surgery happens within a day or two, which we see coming off the ski slopes in a lot of places. And if you talk to colleagues who work in those kind of places, they tell you that they actually never really see this dreaded stiffness that we are all so afraid of. If you do it really early, it may very well be a strategy to avoid that second hit. And those 3 trials basically are starting now. I have to do special things, and this is something I have to do. This is my coworker, Cale Jacobs, without whom I couldn't do any of this work. It looks, unfortunately, a lot better in lederhosen than I do. He wanted me to put that in there, and I have to do that. And then I have to thank my funding sources and my collaborators. And then, so you've all seen this picture of Daniel, and I'm really excited because this is such an honor for me to see how he gets inaugurated. But the one thing I can tell you, his son Thomas, you've got to be careful that he doesn't steal the show. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a very nice talk. We are perfectly on time, so we will close this session for a coffee break. There will be coffee in the room you just were, and we will be starting the inauguration at 4:15. But please come around 4 to the room so you can get your seats. So thanks again to all the speakers for a very nice symposium, and have a good day.
No.